Now you talk about terror. What about for me? I've been terrorized all my day. All my day.
Few individuals did more to shape modern cinema than the actor, director, and producer Charlie Chaplin. One of the greatest of all comic mimes, he also pioneered cinematic techniques and storytelling. His films, with his iconic role as the beleaguered little tramp with baggy trousers, mustache, cane, and bowler hat, were not only comic masterpieces, but unflinching looks at poverty, unemployment, capitalism, exploitation, the callousness of authority, the search for meaning and dignity in a hostile world, and the yearning for love and acceptance. He argued that drama should be derived from the close observation of life. He refused to follow the conventions, including the penchant for exaggerated melodrama, perfecting his work with hundreds of takes, subtle acting, and nuanced facial expressions. He created full-length feature films with highly crafted plots and characters. He strove, he said, to put across the philosophical doubt I feel about things and people. His films, he said, were a metaphysical exercise, an attempt to unmask as absurd, antiquated, and unfair to humanity the idea that there exists a cosmos where humans were held responsible for their actions or the results of their actions. The French filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard wrote of Chaplin that while remaining marginal to the rest of cinema, he ended up filling this margin with more things. What other word can one use? Ideas, gags, intelligence, humor, beauty, movement, than all directors together have put in a whole book. Chaplin, the most famous silent film star of his era, swiftly earned the enmity of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, who saw in his poignant portrayals of the marginalized and forgotten political subversion. The FBI, which began investigating Chaplin in 1922 and would amass an FBI file of 1,900 pages on him for his alleged communist sympathies, finally drove him into exile. In 1952, while Chaplin was in London for the premiere of his film Limelight, the U.S. Attorney General revoked Chaplin's re-entry permit. This ended his Hollywood career. He would spend the rest of his life in Switzerland. Joining me to discuss, in the first of a two-part series, the importance and legacy of Charlie Chaplin is the film director, screenwriter, and producer Martin Brest. Martin has directed numerous films, some of which include Midnight Run with Robert De Niro, which was nominated for a Golden Globe for Best Motion Picture, and Scent of a Woman with Al Pacino, which won a Golden Globe for Best Motion Picture, as well as 4 Academy Award nominations, with Pacino winning for Best Actor, and the blockbuster Beverly Hills Cop, nominated for the Golden Globe Award for Best Motion Picture, and the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay. So, Marty, Charlie Chaplin comes out of vaudeville. He's British, and then the film industry begins to recruit from vaudeville, and we're going to talk about the transformation of the film industry, and much of it pioneered by figures like Chaplin. But describe to us what the film industry was like when Charlie Chaplin arrived in Hollywood.
Well, he started in Hollywood in 1914, and films had been developing as a popular entertainment for the previous 10 years in the United States, but mostly, let's say 6 or 7 years. So it was really primitive. Comedy filmmaking was like a new part of it. That really hadn't established itself yet. There wasn't really a tradition of it. So when he got involved in 1914, it was really as people were trying to figure out how to make comedic films, and everybody was learning on their feet. He started out sort of doing what he was told for the first 5 minutes of his career, and his backlog of skill and sheer luminescent talent started to pull him in his own direction. And he decided that he wanted to direct his own film. So he was writing and directing and acting in it and trying to figure out what this thing was, comedic films. Everybody was trying to figure out what this was. I mean, film as an art form obviously is unprecedented in the history of mankind. This thing that was very, very, very new, storytelling on film, was now being taken to a whole new place, trying to make comedic films on film and what that would be and what comedic characters should be and what comedic stories should be. And it was all unfolding just as he entered. Like, the timing is extraordinary.
Well, you had me watch Making a Living, 1914.
Yeah.
Is that his first film?
Yeah, that's his very
It's not
first.
very good.
No, and he didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to do with him. He had this, more than 10,000 hours. He had this incredible career in English music hall comedy and touring all over England and all over the United States, actually. And he was a star in that world and just a brilliant talent. And he had this reservoir of understanding of how to move an audience and how to make an audience laugh. So when he started, he didn't know how to translate that into film, and nobody knew how to do it. There was no talent that was capable of directing him from the get-go. So it was a slightly awkward start, not terrible. He was very, very young. I think he was 25, and he looked very young. So they tried to make him look older with facial hair and awkward wardrobe. And it wasn't terrible, but he didn't know what to do with his talent. He didn't know how to put his talent in a framework. But he figured that out very, very, very quickly, shockingly quickly.
Before we go on, this is from David Robertson's biography. I just want to talk about Vaudeville. He writes, a music hall act had to seize and hold its audience and make its mark within a very limited time, between 6 and 16 minutes. The audience was not indulgent, and the competition was relentless. The performer in the music hall could not rely on a sympathetic context or build-up. Sarah Bernhardt might find herself following Lockhart's Elephants on the bill. So every performer had to learn the secrets of attack and structure, the need to give the act a crescendo, a beginning, a middle, and a smashing exit to grab the applause. He or she had to learn to command every sort of audience, from a lethargic Monday first house to the Saturday rowdies. He later said, because he was booed. He was quite, as you said, a sensation in vaudeville. But he didn't like live audiences before. Once he got into motion picture, he wouldn't do stage. But many of the people that he drew into his films once he began making films, which we'll talk about, came out of that tradition. Very physical. He was himself quite a fine athlete. But talk about that kind of training and that reservoir of talent and what that talent could do and how it ultimately became successful within the film industry.
Well, again, he was used to working in front of a live audience, thousands and thousands of live audiences by the time he was 25. And some of them, I would imagine, could be very aggressive if things weren't maintained at a certain level. And he knew how to navigate that to the point where it was second nature to him. And then when he had to, stand in front of a camera out on a street with maybe one cameraman and one director and an assistant cameraman, he had to call up, I imagine, that the memory of how his actions would affect an audience seeing this thing in a theater. It's an abstract thing shooting out on a street with just two people watching you. But he had the instincts that were developed from doing it live. And also his imagination coupled with his experience enabled him to do the following. They would go out with their camera and have like a little situation, a guy who wants to sit on a bench in a park and there's a cop there and some little conflict of some kind. They would go out with that most minimal of setup, and he would have to look around and examine everything and see how he can fill it. So when you see a scene And it's filled with delicious detail of how he moves his feet and how he bumps into a thing and how he picks up a thing and flips it and how he uses some little detail on the set for some other thing. Like he'll use something to, buff his nails. That's not intended for that. And something to comb his hair. That's not intended for that. Whatever. Those, that imagination and ability to read the environment and figure out how to fill the moments with things that he knew were going to work in front of an audience was his skill. And he took that to another level. There were a lot of people that sort of could do that, but he was looking for a larger context, which was the thing that started to really separate him from the pack, aside from the fact that he was the most skilled comedian at the time.
So, again, in 1914, he's in this short film, Kid Auto Races at Venice. It's a kind of one gag film where he goes in front of the camera, even though they're trying to film a kid's auto soapbox derby type auto race, and he just wants to be in front of the camera. But that's when he first makes use of the Tramp costume. Let's talk about that costume, which becomes his trademark throughout up until he makes his first talking film.
Well, it's interesting. That film, which I think was the third one he shot, but the second one that was released, and they would make a film a week, basically, these little one-reelers, these 9 or 10-minute films. It's famous for the fact that that's the first time he appeared in a Tramp outfit, which he just, again, he was concerned about looking a little older than he was, so he put on a little mustache. He felt that the little mustache would add years while not hindering his ability to emote. And he put various little, the stories are numerous as to how he found each component, the shoes that were too big, the jacket that was too small, the pants that were too large. But that film, what they would do, and they were trying to make films at such a quick pace that if there was anything going on, like in that case, there was these kids, soapbox racers. Kids would make little race cars out of wooden boxes, and they were having a little competition in Venice, California. So somebody at the studio said, "Go out and make a movie. Let's use this afternoon event for production value." So they would go out, and the premise of the film is actually kind of hip. It's almost like Borat in a way. It's very advanced, considering that film comedy was in such a primitive state. The premise of the film is very simple, and it's a 10-minute film. It's very primitive, which is there's a cameraman and a director out trying to shoot a documentary of these auto races, and some character keeps getting in the way of the camera. Chaplin as the Tramp, and the director of this little documentary is always trying to get him out of the way. But as far as the audience at the time goes, they think this is actually happening. They think somebody is screwing up this this little documentary. So it's kind of like it's kind of a meta comedy for its time. It's very sophisticated.
And at the very end of the film, there's this close-up where he kind of mugs.
Well, I have a theory about the end of the film. In a lot of Chaplin films and a lot of silent comedies, people do all these very physical things. They kick each other, they punch each other, they fly in the air and land on their backs. And really, you just don't know how they're doing it without getting injured. The guy who was directing that film was actually appearing in the film as a director. And I guess they were shooting it in continuity, like in the order that it appeared in the movie, trying to figure out the story as they went. And, this director in the movie is getting physical with Chaplin, kicking him out of the way, et cetera, et cetera. And at the very end of this thing, he gives Chaplin a kick. As Chaplin's walking away, he really gives him a kick in the rear end and sends Chaplin flying. Now, all the guys that Chaplin would work with, all these vaudevillians and music hall performers, they were almost like circus performers. They knew how to do this stuff without injuring each other. And they knew how to fall. They knew how to kick somebody. They knew. This guy was not an actor. He was a director. And I've watched it 1,000 times, and it looks like he really gave him a kick. And Chaplin really went flying. And when Chaplin got up, he looked pissed. Like it's like a real moment. It's not a theatrical, and the movie ends abruptly right after that. So I have a feeling that might have been a pivotal moment when Chaplin decided he wanted to direct his own movies. But I don't know that for sure.
Part of Chaplin's genius is that he realized that much of the shtick, especially the exaggerated gestures, the melodrama, was not, at least for him, going to work on film. And that's a constant. So he brings in these incredibly talented vaudevillian actors who act with him for years. But he understands the intimacy of film very early. And his own portrayals, I mean, we talked about that beautiful scene at the end of City Lights. It's certainly one of the most poignant scenes I've ever seen on cinema. He immediately or very quickly grasps the language of the camera. And in this biography by Robinson, he talks in many cases he likes to work with people who aren't actors because he shows them how to do it. And that people who are actors, especially if they have been schooled in that kind of melodrama, he finds very frustrating. So talk about his understanding of the language of film and how to bring that kind of nuance and depth to filmmaking.
Well, he really had to figure it out for himself. One of the most extraordinary things I find about Chaplin, which I responded to at a very early age, and I think audiences responded to without anybody, I never hear it discussed, which is he found a way to weld your consciousness, your concerns, your very spirit to his character's spirit. He would figure out a way and give time and create moments where he could actually create that bond so that you were with him every step of the way. In fact, it took me years and years and years even to notice this, because I felt it without noticing it, that he would look in the camera like as he's doing but he wouldn't make eye contact with the camera. There's a difference, because then it would break the fourth wall. But he would look into the camera in a way, let's say he's eating or something, he's looking down, and he would like look into the camera as he's doing it. And without you perceiving it, it kind of creates a bond between his spirit and your spirit. It's really a magical thing. I don't know how he came up with it. And it's invisible, but you just can feel it. You can't really notice it. So that was sort of a magical thing that he developed. In terms of his film technique, it's weird. When people talk about the great directors, rarely is he mentioned. People call it Hitchcock and this one and that one and this one and that one. But his name rarely came up as a great director, which to me is to miss the point, because he directed some of the greatest movies, some of the most potent movies of his time. And even though they weren't overtly dazzling, apparently, they weren't overtly dazzling from a technical standpoint, they actually were. He just didn't do fancy things with shots. He laboriously created things to occur within a shot. So it seems simplistic directorially, when in fact it's totally advanced, completely advanced, and just to this day dazzling. In fact, one of the things I find extraordinary is that when you watch movies at that period, so much of it is trapped in time. Even like, for instance, a film like The Kid. There's a scene in The Kid where at the very beginning where Chaplin's wandering through an alley and he sees this little baby wrapped up lying next to the garbage. And you're right there with Chaplin. And then there's the bad guys who left the baby there. And when you look at them, you realize you're watching a movie from 1920. They have like this makeup and they, like this Halloween makeup. And you realize that's the period you're watching. It just so happens that Chaplin transcends the period, and it's happening in the present as far as the viewer goes. So that's a product of a genius and a technique that he developed that directorially, I think he never got enough credit for.
Let's talk about the Tramp. The Tramp is in all of these films. He reminds me of that E.B. White story, Stuart Little. Chaplin himself was very small, 5'2",
Mhm.
125 pounds. He has nothing. He's living in poverty. He's constantly being hounded by the police. Several films, he ends up in jail. I mean, and of course, Chaplin himself grew up in dire poverty,
Mhm.
and he and his half brother Sidney, who worked with him, were sent off to boys' homes because his mother, who had mental health issues, couldn't take care of them, and their father had left. But that figure, which becomes iconic, has built within it a profound class consciousness.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would be an overstatement to say that he was traumatized by poverty in his youth. And his mother was dealing with mental health issues. And he was a childhood of, it was a humiliating upbringing and an upbringing of deprivation. And as he found his voice as an artist, he naturally went to that well and used it. I mean, and it wasn't a contrivance. It was a real. He was really coming from a place, from a memory of pain and deprivation and humiliation, especially in the face of the haves. You know, that contrast is in a lot of his work.
He wrote in 1915 an essay called Illusion of First Time Acting. And he says that the guiding principle for the actor is that they always strive to convince the audience that what they are doing for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, even concert pianists have to do that. If you're playing Chopin, one of the things is to make it feel like you didn't know what the next note was going to be until you hit it. That would be essential. Otherwise, it would seem stiff and airless. And in fact, uh, the nature of creating the scenes that he did, that he created, and with his collaborators were such that, in a way, sometimes they were doing things for the first time in front of the camera. They had certain parameters, and they would come up, use whatever was around to try and, as they went from take to take, to try and improve it and add, delicious complexities to it, and improvisations within the constrictions of within the confinement of the material. But you have to make it seem like it's the first time.
So, as someone who's directed many films, how do you achieve that? Because I assume you, like Chaplin, he would do sometimes, well over 100 takes, take after take after take after
Mhm.
take. How do you achieve it?
It's interesting. I had to introduce Beverly Hills Cop at a big screening in LA 15 years ago or something. And the whole cast was there. Eddie Murphy and John Ashton and Judge Reinhold. And I thought, what am I going to say about that? I don't know what to say. And before I realized it, what I said was, and I'll just introduce it by saying that film was an improvisation. I mean, we had a script, but it got thrown out. We kind of
Well, that's
invented.
very much like Chaplin. That's how he worked.
Well, I didn't realize that, but I came up with a step outline for the whole movie, but not the dialogue and everything to fill it up. So we were shooting with the step outline the day before, trying to create, a script to shoot, and then get to the set and improvise. And what I said when I introduced the film was that I remember hearing that in the silent era, the silent comedians, Chaplin, etc., would have an outline, and they'd get to the set and they'd look around and see what can they use, and they try this, that doesn't work, then they'd shoot it this way, that doesn't work, they shoot it that way, oh, that's good, let's build on that, and they'd kind of do their thing. And one would never think that was, and it isn't possible, but one would never think it would be possible in current day Hollywood, or the Hollywood in this case of the 80s, in the studio system, where you're supposed to have a lockdown script and shoot it as good as you can, and edit it as good as you can. But because of the circumstances that led to that movie being put together, I was able, without realizing, and I only put it together when I introduced the film, that I was able to make a contemporary Hollywood, comedy using silent film comedy techniques, which is get to the set with a bunch of really good guys, in that case, guys, funny guys, and go through the things, see what you can come up with, try it, then try it again, oh, that's good, let's do this, let's do that, and build it scene by scene by scene, and then put it together. And the fact that it looked like a complete movie was kind of amazing. I remember they asked me to do this second one. I thought, I can never pull that off again. This was
But that's interesting, because that's how Chaplin worked. And he talked about how he would be inspired by the physical surroundings. Whatever the props were, he would see, there's that scene, where is it? Maybe it's in The Kid, where he's with another great vaudevillian actor whose name I forget, but they're workmen, and he has the soap. He's trying to wash up. Yeah. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. But he improvised all that.
I don't think he improvised that scene, because that scene had some sort of little on-set special effect to blow bubbles out of it.
No, but he and the other actor created it. I read in the biography that it wasn't supposed to be, but then just the two of them went off and started.
Maybe they rigged up that thing.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny, because I did another film using that kind of technique. I guess it's a technique, which I don't know if you could do it anymore, which is, you have a really solid outline, a really good script, but then it works better for comedy. I wouldn't attempt this in a drama necessarily, although I guess one could. But you every time you do a scene, you just try and keep tweaking it and tweaking it and tweaking it and tweaking it, and see what you can bring to it that you didn't anticipate, and then judiciously edit it together to create the impression that that's how it always was intended. Like, it doesn't look like it was invented, as that stuff in Chaplin movies. That it doesn't betray the creative use of chaos that went into its inception.
So 1 a.m. This is a classic theme of vaudeville: the drunk and the pawn shop.
Yeah.
Let's just talk about those quickly, and then he explodes as a star. But let's talk about those which you both had me watch, and you underlined "watch silently."
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, just to explain, I gave you a list of films to prepare for.
Yes, I watched them all.
And some I specified that you should watch silently. And the reason for that is a lot of silent comedies, I guess silent films in general, somebody comes along and thinks that people want sound for it, and they come up with their own soundtrack, which I'm sure their intentions are sweet. But the music that goes along with a silent comedy or any film becomes essentially the narration. It's very determinative for how the film is interpreted. So to have some who knows who write a little score in 1987 for an old comedy and just put it on YouTube, you're better off watching them silently. It's closer to the original intention, and you'll find that you don't need music, that the silent comedies, and probably silent dramas, but silent comedies, the good ones, almost they don't need music. They have their own music, because the rhythm of not only of events and movement, but the rhythm of how it hits you this a certain rhythm that's meticulously created that provides its own sort of internal music. So to have somebody else's music kind of screw it up is not a great thing. Some of the things I indicated that you should watch with music, because Chaplin, some of the films he made with music, like Modern Times and City Lights, and later on he had the foresight to own the rights to some of his films. The films were ephemeral. Nobody thought that a film had any value 2 years later, 3 or 4. They didn't have any value whatsoever. But somehow he thought that it was a good idea to make sure that he owned the films and preserved them. And sure enough, years later, he re-released them with scores that he wrote.
Well, he was quite an accomplished musician. He played the cello. He played the violin very well.
Mm-hmm.
And his aunt, I remember from the biography, felt it was a shame that he didn't become a musician
Mm-hmm.
because he was so talented. And we talked about this earlier, but if you watch the films, they're so incredibly choreographed. And I want you to address that. But he, of course, would often film, although these were silent films, to music, sometimes bringing in musicians to play. But there's that boxing scene at City Lights, right, which is remarkable. I mean, there's all sorts of scenes. I mean, he was so dexterous, obviously a very good athlete. He lived at the Los Angeles Athletic Club, and he worked out constantly.
Well, this is another aspect of Chaplin's movies that's not given enough attention, which is as the studio, films were silent until the late 20s and 1927-ish, and all of a sudden they started to have dialogue and music in them. And the use of music was being explored, like how do you use music in movies? And Chaplin, I would go so far as to say he was the only director, I don't know if this is true, but I'll bet it's true, that he was the only director of that early period who really was on top of the music for his movies in a way that didn't happen in film probably until the 60s, until Stanley Kubrick in a way. I don't know. I mean, directors may have worked with composers probably not in the 30s and 40s, but maybe in the 50s and 60s. The music was sort of done by the studio. So for a director to really be on top of how his movie was going to be scored, when a piece of music was going to start, when it was going to stop, when that theme was going to be repeated in another place, what should that music be? He was doing that in a way that wasn't done, as I said, until, Stanley Kubrick did it. Like everybody thought it was amazing when they saw 2001 and, all that, amazing music that he used in that. And then, directors like Scorsese and, people that are really on top of the specifics of the music in their movies. Now it's a normal thing. But back then it wasn't done. And his control over the music in his films was extraordinary. The music was extraordinary. How it was used was extraordinary. And it really, it was at a level that was, it was sort of, I hate the word, but it was like auteur driven. It wasn't wallpapered in by the studio later on, sometimes brilliantly or sometimes not.
But he also used music. I mean, this is your theory, which makes complete sense. No, it does. And I know from reading the biography that he frequently had live music playing while they were filming.
Well, in that day, people would use music to sort of help them emote. They'd have off-camera music to help them get in the mood. But there are, as we discussed, there are certain scenes that I'm convinced that when you watch them, they have an uncanny precision to the choreography.
And they're remarkable. I
yeah,
mean,
and they involve sometimes 2, sometimes 3 people doing things with incredible precision. And, for instance, a character will turn away and he'll turn back at a precise moment in relationship to the other person's action that there's no way to cue. And these things play out over in one shot of duration.
Well, it's like the scene we were talking about, is it City Lights, where he's or is it The Dog's Life, where the dog is eating eating the hot dogs, but he's eating these little cakes, and he has to take it, just at the precise
Oh,
moment.
yeah. In A Dog's Life, where he's
Yeah.
eating little cream puffs.
Yeah.
He's stealing them off of a food cart that it's his half brother's playing the other actor, and it's extraordinary. What it is, for those who haven't seen it, is this guy has a food cart and he suspects Chaplin is sort of a shifty character, and when this guy turns away, the owner of the food cart, Chaplin steals a little cream puff. And the guy is getting wise to it. He turns around just as Chaplin gets it in his mouth, and the timing of it over the whole course of the scene is phenomenal. The guy always turns when Chaplin just has done it, has hidden the cream puff away in his mouth, and you wonder, how is this possible? And I'm sure that they rehearsed it to music.
It's also that boxing scene, which is brilliant.
City Lights, I'm sure that too. Clearly, you can see them dancing in a rhythm. It almost.
But he describes for him as acting as a dance, fundamentally a dance.
That's interesting.
I may have butchered that quote, but he describes being on the set as a dance.
Yeah, well, sometimes you see him enter a scene, for instance, and before he engages with the specific action of a scene, he'll do all these things that are just phenomenal. It is like a dance. So he moved better than anybody in film. I mean, he just was extraordinary. And again, it wasn't just for the flash of it. Everything was about engaging the audience's attention to the dilemma of the character.
But when you watch it or rewatch it, there are all these subtle, tiny gestures that are hilarious that you miss the first time around. Everything is so incredibly choreographed. I mean, there's a real artistry.
Yeah, he never lets down it's like fishing. He never lets slacken the line. The line in this case being the audience's bond with his character's dilemma, and as it follows that dilemma throughout the course of the movie.
Was there any other director of his caliber during that time period?
Not when it came to comedy. Buster Keaton sort of co-directed to some extent. It's a little blurry, but Buster Keaton, I would say, is the closest to having that kind of total control and total, not control, that's an ugly word, total determination of a project. Buster Keaton was, they were the two titans.
You had D.W. Griffith.
Yeah, who had a zero sense of humor. In fact, D.W. Griffith, he had Biograph Studios. They were on 14th Street in Manhattan. And he had this one assistant who said, why don't we make comedies? This was like in 1911, 1912. Why don't we make comedies? Comedies would be good, or maybe even 1909. And D.W. Griffith was like, just didn't have a comedic bone in his body. And this guy said, we're making movies, comedies would be, let's do it. And it never happened. So I think this guy tried to make some comedies for the company D.W. Griffith was the star of, and I don't think it worked out particularly. So the guy went out to California and started his own company. His name was Max Sennett, and he became the first sort of, the Henry Ford of film comedy. And that's who Chaplin went to work for. He was the first guy that really sort of industrialized the development of film comedy in America.
Chaplin becomes so big, and we'll talk about this in the second segment, that he founds his own studio, produces his own films. But let's talk about the constraints that he faced within the studio system of the time. First of all, they were churning out one film after another. They didn't do many takes. They were, I think I remember reading, every film had to end with a chase. But talk about the constraints that he was under.
Well, when you say the studio system, what we think of as a studio system really started in the late 20s, early 30s. So, and he was really starting out in the mid-teens. So it wasn't quite, it was a different kind of system, which was basically Max Sennett, who had this lot and 1,000 wacky comedy guys and circus guys and all kinds of people and bathing beauties and, and animals. And they just would, certain people would go out and just make these movies once a week. So he had to do it within that constraint. And because he didn't really have, at the very beginning, he didn't have the pull. He had to fit into their way of doing it. But it was, as I said, very, very early on, it was apparent that he was like a special thing, and he wanted to do things in a more precise way than they were used to, and in a less, when people think of things like the Keystone Cops, which was at Max Sennett, which is kind of become synonymous with very broad slapstick, which is considered very low. When I watch them, I'm in shock at the artistry and the precision. I mean, stuff that nobody could do today. There's nobody that could.
Is that because they came out of vaudeville, so they were essentially trained?
They came out of vaudeville, and some of them were circus performers, and they were essentially all stuntmen, and they knew how to do very complicated, dangerous physical things safely and comedically. So it seems very low, but it's actually the precision involved is awesome. Even in these dopey Keystone Cop chase movies, I mean, when you see what these guys do, the stunts and things that play out in a long continuous shot that involve, dangerous hits and people, missing each other barely. And it's just spectacular. But Chaplin very quickly decided he wanted to do something that was more based around a very specific character that he was developing, and wanted to make sure that anything that was funny, any gags, any shtick would suit the character, not be there for itself, not be there for any other reason than to help the storyline and his character's arc progress forward. I mean, that developed, obviously in the beginning it wasn't as strict about it, but he was really concerned about developing the integrity of a certain kind of character and a certain kind of emotion around the character, a certain kind of story around that. And all that happened very quickly. It started in 1914, and it was already by 1915, 16, he was doing that. And nobody had ever seen anything like it.
Well, and the film studios, because he's so popular, have to give him more and more leeway in terms of because they didn't like to do, and they wanted these things just churned out
right
on an
but
assembly
very
line.
quickly they saw what they had, and he was he became the most famous person on the planet.
Yeah.
I mean, in every country, because the films were silent, there was no language barrier. He was everywhere. So his salary started to go up, and he got more self-control. And he used that, not self-control, control. And he used that control in a way that, again, like I think of a director like Kubrick, who insisted on and developed the right to have that kind of total control at a time when directors didn't have that control. And he did everything. He was the alpha and omega of a decision-making on his films. And Chaplin started that in the teens, which was unprecedented. And obviously he was very successful at it. And that kept building his power base and his ability to make bigger and more complicated films at a scale that people didn't really, that weren't really of their time. Like,
was he the first to sort of put I mean, you had Birth of a Nation. I don't know what year that was.
I think that was 1914.
Was it that early?
I think so,
So, I mean, that was the kind of full-length feature type film.
Yeah, that was.
But they weren't doing that in comedy, were they?
Well, there was one. There was one. I think it was Tilly's Punctured Romance, I think.
Oh.
There was one that Chaplin was in, the first feature-length comedy. But that wasn't his movie, really. And it wasn't really followed by a lot of them. Yeah, I mean, he started developing longer and longer movies, which were against the grain of what was going on. But, the box office rewarded it.
And that's what we're going to talk about in the second segment. That was film director, screenwriter, and producer Martin Brest. I want to thank the Real News Network and its production team, Cameron Granadino, Adam Coley, David Hebden, and Kayla Rivera. You can join us for part 2 of our discussion of Charlie Chaplin next week, and you can find me at chrishedges.substack.com.
Thank you so much for watching the Real News Network, where we lift up the voices, stories, and struggles that you care about most. And we need your help to keep doing this work, so please tap your screen now, subscribe, and donate to the Real News Network. Solidarity forever.